Welcome to the Carbon Exposure Project, a platform for peer-to-peer conversations with the people that are helping to shape the carbon markets of tomorrow. Join me, Rene Velasquez, as I get to have conversations on topics ranging from ESG and finance over cocktails in the Lion City of Singapore. Cheers. Today we welcome Dale Hardcastle, partner at Bain & Co. We get to sit down and discuss the imperative for carbon markets and the critical role they play to catalyze and drive innovation and finance to where it can deliver impact and help in decarbonization. Thanks. Dale, thanks for joining me on the Carbon Exposure Project. It's a pleasure to see you again, and thanks for coming.
Hey, thanks so much, Rene. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah. Hey, we were just chatting before off camera, and you were just mentioning you just got back from New York Climate Week. How was that from your perspective?
Yeah, no, fresh off the plane, and it was a pretty amazing week. As always, New York Climate Week is less one thing than many things ongoing sort of simultaneously. But there was a lot of excitement and discussion about kind of carbon markets and sort of the nature imperative and sort of other things. And I guess a few sort of interesting sort of reflections came out of the week.
Great, I'd love to hear them.
I mean, one, clearly, as you would expect, there's been a huge change in the market and the overall sort of dynamic between where we were in 2021 and last week.
Yeah.
Which clearly, provided some consternation, some concern. But I think there was also a lot of alignment and sort of interest that the industry needs to retake control of the narrative.
I completely agree.
And really, re-stress kind of the positivity of nature, kind of the importance of these markets and how that kind of all fits together. Well, maybe there's not clarity exactly how to do that, and a recognition that it isn't going to be a 2-month sort of effort. Is probably kind of a longer issue.
Yeah, sure.
But I think a lot of sort of interest in it. So I think that was one thing. I think second, a lot of concern about kind of the mismatch between supply and demand, particularly as we look at some elements of the voluntary market, where the kind of the slowdown in sort of demand and the pullback, I think from a lot of corporates, both publicly as well as privately, has some suppliers a little bit sort of nervous, particularly in the red and sort of other markets and the like.
But that's more of a short-term bug effect.
Yeah, well, I think that's the question, right? And,
yeah.
Particularly people sort of wondering, how long do we need to wait for kind of a rebound and a recovery? Are we going to see kind of the market sort of bottom and sort of stabilize in 2024, or could this be more protracted?
Okay.
And I guess that really ties in with maybe kind of the third thing that was talked about a lot, which was, where are we sort of going with sort of corporate demand and the like? How quickly are we going to see that sort of scale up, and where's that sort of going?
That's a great feedback. Thank you for that in terms of insights. Can I unpack the first bit, which is essentially the underlying imperative for the market? Because as you said, it's been challenged. There's been pullback in terms of commitments. There's a lot of consternation you mentioned with regards to sort of the integrity around the market, and that's being addressed fairly inclusively across multiple different stakeholders. But let's talk about, if you don't mind, the imperative for the voluntary carbon market itself as a foundational element. Do you mind?
Sure. No, I think it's always really great to go back to first principles, right? And to me, the way we sort of think about it is starting with the Paris Agreement and how we build up from there.
Yeah.
So one thing that's often sort of forgotten and little sort of appreciated is as we think about nature, particularly as it sort of relates to climate action and the road to sort of net zero. Significant transformation around kind of nature, force, and sort of other things is essentially baked into the Paris Agreement already before we even talk about the mitigation hierarchy and a lot of the things.
Yeah.
While not specific on the numbers, something on the orders of 6 gigatons of kind of emissions sort of came from forestry loss and other things over the last few years.
It's significant.
So it's on the order of kind of 10% of the market and sort of everything else. And as we look at what's been sort of baked in, I think there's really an expectation that not only will we sort of completely stop all of that sort of deforestation, but we will progressively sort of flip to have a significant sort of increase in sort of carbon sinks. At the same time, also having a radical sort of transformation in agriculture and a lot of other things. So in some ways, if we're not able to kind of address these sort of challenges, then the road to net zero is a bust, no matter what we're able to do with corporates and sort of other things. So I think it's really the foundation, and we have to find a way to kind of capitalize on this, not just for kind of climate action, but also nature, biodiversity, and all the other things that we know are kind of the center,
really
central
important.
tenets of the market.
Okay, so, I mean, so that I love that first principles approach. Leading on from that, you also kind of mentioned in that introduction the pullback from the corporates, and now this transition effectively in the market as we look to scale. And you mentioned that it's ultimately it's a process, and then the market is having dialogue and discussing how to do that. But now there's actually also the implementation piece. You want to unpack that kind of
Sure.
component?
I mean, clearly, I think a lot of people, of course, very focused on how do we sort of scale up the market, which, in particularly, I think the demand side.
Sure.
Great work has happened over the kind of the last few years in sort of incentivizing sort of supply, looking at market integrity, infrastructure, a lot of other things. But one of the things that we recognized kind of in our work last year was it did seem like there were some questions around where we were going with demand, and Bain has been working sort of closely with a broad working group with the World Economic Forum over the last sort of 12 to sort of 18 months to really sort of dig into this demand side issue and the like.
Okay.
And if we sort of tie this sort of together with what we were talking about in terms of the criticality of scaling the market, in order to really address the climate action and move the capital and do the other things that we talked about, we need to scale this market beyond the sort of early adopters to the next 100, 300, 500 sort of companies.
Okay. So it's like moving from the folks that are in the leading pack to effectively the middle of the pack. How do we incentivize that? Correct?
Exactly. And this is, as we sort of think about kind of any S-curve for technology adoption or a new market, the things and motivations that drove the early adopters, the Salesforces, the Microsofts, and others to kind of come in and sort of seed and catalyze this market are very different from the next 500 sort of corporates.
I completely agree on that.
Who need to make a different case to their boards, who need different guardrails, who need a much more explicit sort of ROI to be able to invest.
And they also have different essentially balance sheets in terms of strength at the capital level, but then also in terms of the liability side of things from the carbon perspective on that balance sheet, right? Because you identified folks in the tech space, relatively pretty strong, like dollar balance sheets and relatively low carbon footprints. Wouldn't you agree? And then ultimately you're looking towards encouraging the participation of folks in the middle of the pack that may be the inverse of that, may have really emissions intensive businesses. Let's think industrials, let's think the steel companies, all these folks in shipping, aviation, etc., relative to their financial strength. So it's a different sort of calculation, right?
Yeah,
right?
So I think
in terms of justification to the board.
A different imperative, a very different sort of check to sign.
Yes.
And I think also different risk appetite, right?
Different risk appetite.
Far less willing to kind of seed direct air capture and scale that up from the start.
Sure.
Or sort of other sort of technologies and the like. And particularly as we think about these heavy emitters, we're talking real tickets, right? It's for them to sort of come into the market at sort of scale. We're not talking $1-2 million. We're talking tens of millions.
Tens or hundreds. Yeah.
And just I think from my own reflection, working with a lot of corporates and a lot of boards sort of over the years, as much as we personally within the market, believe in these narratives around nature and the community and the impacts we're seeking to drive. They want much more sort of hard-nosed sort of decisions around where do we invest, how do we invest, what is the risks, are we going to be sort of called out and sued if things don't go the right way?
Yeah.
And really,
and these are material risks.
Exactly.
For a lot of boards, especially because they have fiduciary obligations here, right? And so, how does a corporate navigate through this kind of murky waters at the moment?
Well, I think that's really kind of the inflection point we're at in the market, right?
Yeah.
How do we sort of begin to sort of retake sort of control? How do we begin to more readily sort of integrate how carbon kind of credits and offsets and other sort of climate action that is above and sort of beyond the mitigation that we do within our value chain fit into our net zero pathway, particularly the transition period as we think about today to sort of 2030 and sort of 2035, where the ambiguity around this has been, I think, a real deterrent to being able to sort of scale up that market. And somehow we need to sort of close the gap here to more strategically help companies to embed that.
Okay.
So I think that's one thing, and maybe two or three others. I mean, one,
please,
clearly we need some different sort of incentives. And then lastly, we also need to more clearly give companies air cover, for the lack of a better word, to know that if they take these actions, even if the standards and the expectations change in 3 and 5 years, as we know they're going to change within the market, they will not be seen as bad actors, for the things that they did today with the positive intention.
Amen to that. I think that's clearly imperative, right? In terms of those incentives, because absolutely, things change, things evolve over time. Looking back, it's very punitive to effectively punish companies for taking voluntary action. where their peers did not. It seems kind of perverse,
Yeah.
but it's happened.
Yeah. No, exactly. And I think this is, particularly as someone who, has come to the market from a different sort of perspective, over the last, 5 to sort of, 7 years. One thing that's really sort of striking to me that I think is often sort of forgotten is, as we look at the carbon market, particularly on the voluntary side, the expectations of what people expect this market to deliver, what a carbon project is supposed to deliver, the outcomes, the rigor and the intensity is, of course, quite different than 5 or 10 years ago.
Sure.
And that the expectations of the market that it is going to be a critical lever to channel billions of dollars of capital to drive action in communities and the carbon, accounting and sort of other things, has dramatically sort of turned on a dime. And of course, we're going through a period of growing pains and the challenges of being able to kind of move that sort of forward with little sympathy or recognition for the transformation that the whole sort of integrated ecosystem here is having to go through.
Yeah, that's a fascinating approach in terms of how you're looking at it. But it's that transformation. We're trying to transform industry and pivot towards a decarbonization and also energy transition pathway. And that's not easy. Essentially, large moving objects moving in one direction, trying to channel them to move in a different direction. So you're absolutely correct in identifying the incentives need to be aligned in order to change that behavior. So how do we do that? What sort of incentives should we be looking at? The collective we, governments, institutionals, enterprise. How do we drive that coherence so we can drive towards decarbonization?
Well, some of the, I think the easier sort of, positive steps have come, on that integration around the kind of the compliance market and carbon taxes.
Yeah.
As we look at, Singapore's kind of leading sort of efforts, of course, Colombia, South Korea, other countries that also have sort of similar sort of schemes, that sort of on-ramp to bring, more companies, into the market and sort of balance that out is of course super positive.
Yeah.
But of course, that's, I think, just one step of kind of a bigger sort of effort that we want to sort of catalyze and drive. I think ultimately, in our view, to be able to really, bring these heavy emitters and other sort of scale sort of companies into the market, we need to find ways to allow them to somehow utilize, this market as part of their pathway to net zero.
Yeah, a tool in the arsenal.
Yeah, and while ultimately, this doesn't sort of supersede the mitigation hierarchy or maximizing efforts within their value chains and other things, many sort of industries don't necessarily have a way to sort of fully sort of deliver on their sort of SBTI pathway today.
Yeah.
There's a need to find ways to give them some more latitude to address their scope 3 emissions, to balance out kind of year-on-year differences when things maybe move slower or faster. Which to me is far more logical and sort of palatable than having them do nothing.
Completely. That's the perverse outcome that I think we need to focus on in terms of excluding that. We need to drive action and we need to be constructive, effective in how we do that. So that's
the fundamental problem, really we have today, right?
Yes.
We've really sort of flipped over the last sort of, 12 to 18 months from a situation where companies had an incentive to act to now where they really have a strong disincentive to do anything just because of the risks and sort of the blowback and other sort of concerns. To me, I guess, really, I think two things have been lost, right, that are sort of underpinning that. One is the complete loss of the kind of implicit sort of incentives around climate neutrality, carbon neutrality claims and other things which have become taboo. Not to say that there weren't problems with that and sort of everything else, but companies need, some kind of a tag that says they are a good climate actor or doing things for the environment to get them to do more and do faster.
Exactly.
And then second, relates to the expectation that SBTI was going to sort of, I think, open these up more explicitly, which of course hasn't happened. So I think the double whammy of those two things has really sort of, as well as kind of the broader sort of narrative, the press
has effectively
has really sort of led people to pull back.
Yeah.
And that of course is, driven, some of the high level sort of departures we've seen with, Delta, Nestle and sort of others who have moved their investments other places, which is, I think, a real loss for nature, a loss for sort of society and the kind of action we want to drive.
I would agree. Let's take a pause. That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
Cheers. How's the drink?
It's good.
It's apple juice and a bit of cherry liquor. But it looks like an old fashioned or a
It looks
Manhattan.
impressive.
Yes. Camera magic.
It's your condiments.
Yeah, well, I'll change it up. I'll figure out some other stuff. So thanks, Dale. That's really fascinating. I want to pick up on the two essentially incentives pieces that you just outlined. You said implicit and explicit incentives. Implicit in the terms, like on the terminology effectively around carbon neutrality, essentially a way to simply communicate voluntary action and essentially harness that as momentum. And then the explicit component around essentially the license to include carbon offsets in that pathway from folks such as SBTI. Where would you like to start? But I'd like to unpack both. So I'll give you
Sure.
your
No,
choice.
I think they're really sort of important, sort of fundamental questions. Ultimately, corporates want some kind of reward or recognition, for their actions.
And this is voluntary action. Let's just stress that point. It's voluntary action. They should receive compliments for it.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's in the absence of a compliance incentive.
Yeah. No, and I think part of it to me is also, in some ways, as we think about the carbon market and the incentives to act, we're faced by almost different markets today operating sort of simultaneously.
I agree. So markets within a market.
Exactly. So on the one hand, we have the kind of the climate leaders we talked about, who are the first movers, often kind of the big tech companies and sort of other players who have really sort of been out in front, working towards delivering kind of net zero commitments by 2030 or other sort of short-term time horizons. And they, I think, have a high propensity to kind of buy premium sort of removal credits, and they're very sort of concerned about the tight timelines to be able to deliver that, the short pathways and sort of other things.
And they're inherently difficult because they're at the vanguard of the technology cycle, essentially, right?
Yeah.
You're talking long-term permanence, you're talking direct air capture, enhanced soil weathering, rock weathering, a bunch of other things, soil carbon, etc.
Yeah. No, exactly. And we have, a small set of companies with a high propensity to pay, sort of all competing for that segment of the market as they look at that narrow trajectory over there.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we have, I think, a much bigger set of companies who are, industrial, who are on kind of longer sort of trajectories, who are really sort of trying to figure out the difficult path of significant investments to decarbonize their value chains, and then look at additional activities that fit on top of that. Where the kind of the concern today is much less around the source of supply, but the source of demand. Particularly given the uncertainty around this sort of incentives and how that sort of fits together, and the questions that raises around, what is demand going to be for the broader set of voluntary market sort of credits in 24 and 2025.
Yes.
And in some ways, we also have, I think, the broader sort of concerns around sort of quality and the degree to which there's almost, I think, a perverse incentive today to focus sort of investments on replanting forests that have already been cut down while doing nothing about stopping the deforestation.
Yeah, that's a completely perverse incentive.
Which is really a complete market failure.
It's a market failure, but it's also ludicrous. But again, it's a very small but vocal group of effectively ideologues that are essentially driving that narrative. And you mentioned also taking control of the narrative once again to bring back logic to the equation. I think that's what's been missing.
Exactly, and I think it's really important that we're able to kind of turn that sort of around. Particularly because, again, reflecting back on Climate Week, one thing that was very sort of positive, despite the concerns about demand, was there's still a lot of interest in investing in the market.
Yes.
Particularly on the supply side in terms of high quality credits, people looking at making long-term investments, funds being raised, lots of other things, which gives one sort of hope about the overall sort of trajectory.
I think so too.
But I think the big risk is, if demand doesn't sort of rematerialize in 2024 and 2025, are we going to see companies and individual investors continue to sort of put money into new projects and other things?
Yeah, no, that's a real risk potentially. And then essentially there's also that lag. Effectively, when this investment comes into play, there's an implementation time horizon to actually get these to actually yield carbon credits, high quality ones, to provide that supply to the market. That timeline continues to expand. Essentially, the standards are under a lot of pressure to get it right, to demonstrate to the market that they have high integrity. But as a result, the throughput, the speed at which the supply actually gets through is slower and slower and slower on a regular basis. So now you have timing risk. Effectively, this is what you're talking about, where investment dollars come in, but they actually take time to actually provide a return to those investors. And if, like you're saying, if the timing isn't ideal and the market's still in a bottom swing, that's not great for encouraging more investment on the long-term pathway. That's worrying.
No, it sets up, I think, a real crisis for the market.
It's a negative feedback loop. But conversely, on the other side, I'm an eternal optimist. I'm a rational optimist. I like to sort of qualify myself as that. A little bit biased, but anyway, hear me out. I do think that broader macro and the integrity issues here do get resolved over time. I just think that this is a natural evolution of a market that's seeking a North Star, essentially. Integrity is key. People are working on that. I think there are really robust systems in place and people working on making that reality. I think you outlined something really important, which is that the demand side is trying to find out exactly where they are. Okay, you have the Microsofts of the world effectively looking at the CDR side, the carbon dioxide removals piece of the equation. But you've got a lot of these other heavy emitters in the middle side of that distribution curve. They have a very difficult pathway to get to net zero. And that trajectory gets steeper and steeper and steeper over time as they kind of keep pushing the time horizon. So I think that there's actually more demand that's actually underlying in the market that comes in. So let me just take the opposite side of the argument. What happens if a significant demand quotient is actually unlocked? There's essentially the market gaps up effectively. More demand comes in, you still have anemic supply, and that's effectively a shock to the system. The market prices start to inflect and move upwards. That's a dislocating
No, I think that's
kind of pressure.
it's definitely a real possibility.
Mm.
And listen, despite some of the challenges we talked about, I'm equally sort of optimistic and really sort of a believer in, the importance and the power of these markets.
Yeah.
I would sort of reflect on lots of kind of the one-to-one sort of discussions we've had with our clients and sort of other companies, through this project over the last 12 months. Lots and lots of companies want to do more. And I think they want to do a lot more. They can see that they want to sort of, drive and put forward sort of multiple sort of outcomes, not just around carbon, but looking at sort of nature positive things that they want to do around their plants and their operations. They're looking for a pathway and sort of, I think, guardrails to be able to sort of do this.
Yes.
But they need, at the same time, to be able to kind of tap into that incentives, which shows that they're going to get kind of recognition and credit, both to make sure that people don't say they're doing the wrong thing,
Yeah.
but also get rewarded for what they're doing.
Okay.
So somehow we need to sort of close the loop, between those things, and ultimately, probably sort of collectively sort of work to, work with, people like sort of SBTI and sort of others to help sort of define, what is the pathway and how might we be able to keep that sort of pressure on net zero while sort of opening up sort of other opportunities for these kinds of beyond value chain sort of investments and the like.
Yeah, whilst not replacing or moving away from the tradition of the mitigation hierarchy, there still needs to be internal reductions, and offsets are a key component to actually help to price that and ultimately drive that incentive. So let's talk about that explicit incentive for a second. The SBTI side of things, that's essentially the elephant in the room. By omission, over the last year or two, SBTI has essentially advocated for no inclusion of carbon instruments in that hierarchy, in that transition pathway. But they, in Climate Week, just recently published a call to action, essentially here for the market, to say, hey, prove it to us that these instruments, whether it's RECs or offsets, warrant an inclusion in that hierarchy. Can I ask you to comment on that?
No, I think that's great. I mean, it finally, after kind of years of waiting and sort of pushing, at least sort of begins to sort of open a door and a pathway that may offer some latitude to be able to do that. And to their sort of credit, they've been very sort of upfront about the fact that we're prepared to sort of consider sort of alternatives, but show us the evidence. Show us the proof that companies would do more faster and better, while still continuing to sort of decarbonize, commit to sort of targets to sort of bring things sort of forward if we're able to do this. Because I think they rightly want to make sure that they don't sort of put in jeopardy the infrastructure that's sort of built around net zero and SBTI today, while opening up the latitude for more companies to come in and do more and the like.
Yeah, I think what I would commend them, and I had a conversation with Swati Mandlow from WWF just recently, and we talked about this component. Give credit to SBTI in terms of the rate at which they've achieved effectively onboarding of thousands of corporates to globally to actually make these commitments that are science-based. So that's the first thing, because as a practitioner in this market for almost 2 decades, we've been doing that, but very, very slow and inefficiently on a one-to-one basis. They've effectively created the kind of the hierarchy and the framework effectively to incentivize corporates to now make these pledges, and they're aligned with science. So that's fantastic. And now it's the next bit. How do we actually harness not only the commitment, but actually the tools to empower that action? Because my belief is the rational sort of economic actor here is that without a pricing of that externality, these are just commitments, but there's no penalty for missing them. And effectively, we cannot take the foot off the gas right now. We don't have the time. We don't have that luxury.
Yeah.
So also the other hope is that the market itself and all the different proponents therein actually heed this opportunity and respond to the SBTI call.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, there's
Would you
no
agree?
question, right?
Yeah.
Economic incentives drive behavior, especially with sort of corporates and boards and sort of other
Absolutely.
things. And I think equally on the other side, as we also look at, what's happening with, carbon markets and the ability to sort of channel sort of carbon finance there. For instance, if we look at kind of where we sort of sit today, sort of Indonesia, or sort of other sort of, countries in the region, there's just such a gross, disconnect between the potential, value economically of a land for palm or for, sort of forestry and sort of timber versus carbon.
Yes.
And that's why I think it's also sort of, critically important to be able to connect those markets to allow kind of export and those prices to sort of flow through to give landowners a different sort of economic incentive to say, we shouldn't necessarily just go one route and sort of, cut down the forest to sort of create sort of further land for palm or sort of other things. But really should actively sort of think about opportunities around kind of carbon and other things too.
And that's really important because that's essentially the transition in action, right? We talk about energy transition that's visible in terms of moving from one source of energy to others over time. But in this case, we're saying, hey, there needs to be incentives to drive behavioral change to shift away from destructive practices to constructive ones, effectively protecting the native ecosystems from a biodiversity perspective, but from a carbon perspective, let's put a value on that and drive that change. And then, like you said, essentially in the carbon sinks or around the equatorial belt, you have economies that can greatly benefit from effectively tapping into a new asset class. They can view it as a commodity or an asset class, but effectively being able to commercialize that and drive revenue to their economies and provide opportunities for employment and scaling up those communities, those systems, those services sectors, the trading hubs, etc.
And that story is, what we're doing a poor job of really communicating the way that we need to sort of today. And that's probably where, a much more sort of proactive effort is needed to look at, where's the middle ground between some of the people who are shooting at the market and the clear benefits of, what this can achieve when it's done well. Obviously, everything is not going to be perfect.
No, it never is.
But if we're not able to sort of open up these channels and sort of take it forward, no capital is going to flow. And that puts us 3 steps backwards.
Completely. And we just don't have the time to waste effectively.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. I like that. Cheers.
Cheers.
How's sound? Good?
All good?
All right. I'll be like, hello, how you doing?
Yeah.
I'm just fucking with him. All right. Thanks. Dale, thanks. Again, riveting conversation. I love this essentially just dialogue, this dance that we've got going on here. I want to pivot away necessarily from the incentives piece that we just unpacked, and let's bring it to the actual perspective on the corporate side. How do they operationalize this action? So let's assume now the incentives are aligned. I touched on the kind of decoupling between supply and demand and essentially the pressure that creates, right, on the market side. But I think we don't spend enough time, certainly folks from my side of the market, talking in the open around the intricacies of building and developing portfolios and how those mature over time, how there's a transition baked in terms of long-term offtakes. There's a perception in the market that companies just buy the lowest cost offsets and they're buying renewables, right? And now that's it. It's an indulgence. It's not. The reality is that the corporate actors that are really at this vanguard, that are taking voluntary action, have got well-designed and defined strategies for decarbonization long-term, the role that carbon markets and carbon offsets play in that strategy, and the transition that happens over time, where we're moving away from avoidance credits traditionally on the technology side to avoidance credits on the nature-based side, towards removals on the nature-based side, towards tech-based removals. It's a transition. And there's different pricing inputs for various different instruments, and there's different access of those various instruments over time. So there's essentially a lot of levers that corporates are essentially having to juggle with or adjust in order to bring down their emissions and build out these portfolios towards to decarbonize essentially. So can you give me some perspectives on that? You're speaking to corporates on a daily basis around how they're managing that approach, because it's complex.
It's a great point, and even the complexity you kind of outlined only scratches the surface
Only scratches the surface.
of
Yeah.
it. And I think this is part of the dilemma for many sort of companies today is this is a super dynamic space,
Yeah.
and the rules are always changing, and there's a lot of things to sort of keep up with, which makes it very sort of complicated for sort of corporate teams who are sort of thinking about this to stay on top of it and be able to sort of push and sort of go forward
Yeah.
to and the like. Since obviously every company can't have 20 people that work on a team sort of managing this, and often it's just a couple of people trying to think it together.
Exactly. And they're overwhelmed. They're not just doing this more often than not. They're also just keeping up with disclosure requirements and other internal stakeholder engagement processes and the like. And this is just one of 100 things that they're also doing.
Yeah.
It's
No,
difficult.
absolutely. And in some ways, kind of the dilemma and the challenge that you mentioned was a bit of the inspiration for kind of the recent project that we referred to earlier that we've undertaken with the WEF and about 40 different companies.
Yeah.
Which ultimately sought to be a bit of a playbook to sort of think about how can sort of corporates participate and sort of scale their activity within the market. I would really describe it as a bit of a synthesis of kind of the experience of a lot of the leading companies that we've talked about.
Yep.
To sort of Temasek and Salesforce and Microsoft and Heineken and many others. More than I can mention at the time.
Sure.
But all of them, I think, were very sort of kind of open and generous to try to kind of put this together to kind of share some of the lessons, both on where the market is today and where we see it sort of going over the horizon, so that those next set of companies can move sort of faster. And maybe to touch on, I guess, a few different sort of things that were in there.
I love that.
First, I think everyone sort of agreed that, companies need to think more strategically about, how do carbon credits and whatever sort of investments they're going to make in sort of projects fit in with the overall sort of decarbonization strategy that the company's doing, as well as kind of the broader sustainability strategy and often the multiple sort of objectives that they're seeking to deliver simultaneously as they look at the sort of corporate strategy and how sort of carbon and nature sort of fit in. So I think that's definitely sort of the first thing. As you say, there's also a lot of questions around portfolio construction, both in terms of to what degree do we invest in avoidance versus removal versus other sort of technology solutions and like. I think many companies today are looking at kind of the Oxford Principles approach, where this portfolio sort of shifts over time with kind of a natural sort of evolution and the like. The other thing I think a lot of companies are also sort of grappling with is, to what degree should we move upstream? The events of kind of the last sort of few years have given companies sort of concern about, can I sort of source the highest quality credits? How do I turn the integrity of what I sort of buy and sort of other things? And on some level, the easiest thing to do is
that supply as well.
Exactly.
Because if it's scarce by definition, right, and there's competition for that supply, obviously it's got inflationary price pressures. There's got to be a point at which it's no longer rational, right? But hopefully over time the supply builds, and that's got a deflationary pressure on the price, and start to see the compression of those multiples. So.
And I think part and parcel of that, also goes into the question of like, how active do we want to be?
Yes.
Clearly there's, I think, a strong logic to have intermediaries to sort of supply our portfolio and to help us manage those things.
Sure.
But also, some companies want to be much more sort of deeply involved in the whole sort of value chain and the like, which is a pretty, strategic decision for companies to kind of work through.
But that's obviously going to require more acumen, internal resources to be able to define and delineate essentially those opportunities to go further upstream. It requires a high degree of sophistication, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And I think sophistication is also something that all companies are increasingly sort of thinking about. How do we sort of upskill ourselves to better manage the sourcing, but also how do we sort of think about kind of managing risk within the marketplace? Yeah,
the risk is a really interesting component. Can you unpack that for me? Because the perceptions of risk, they're multiple components of risk. What are the key ones?
No, so absolutely. So I mean, clearly there's sort of concern around, just delivery and sort of, the kind of the outcomes that the companies are sort of, seeking to drive, kind of the permanence of the credits, kind of the co-benefits, the degree to which, the money sort of flows through to the right people who are supposed to be able to do things, and ultimately, what's going to sort of happen long term.
Sure.
Which of course I think also ties together with the interest we see from many companies also in ratings agencies these days, having that sort of third-party assurance with the Calix and the Silveras and the B0s of the world, and as well as sort of MRV and sort of other things. So as I say, a lot of balls that
a lot of balls in the air.
Kind of,
and then there's the sort of the technical component ones around the portfolio structuring piece. There's a timing risk. There's a counterparty risk. When you go further upstream, you start to uncover some of those risks, and it takes a lot to effectively manage that approach. I think what we'll see is inevitably companies will want to go upstream, and then essentially they find a happy medium. Essentially, the pendulum swings, and they'll find where it's comfortable for them in that swing. Essentially, some will want to be at that front of it. Essentially, for supply that's really constrained. Think the DAX sort of credits of the world. But on the nature-based side, where there's much more supply, I think going upstream is probably not possible for many companies, just given the scale of a lot of these projects. So just ensuring supply, but on a long-term curve, there's a price risk as well. Like how steep is that curve, or how flat is that curve? And obviously there's the push and pull there as well. There's lots of those things to really
absolutely
manage.
And a lot of things for a corporate executive to sort of manage, simultaneously.
It's not a simple procurement strategy of a existing commodity.
But I think maybe one other thing that is also quite important, particularly given the events of the last sort of year or two, and sort of linking kind of strategy and sort of action sort of together, is having a clear and sort of compelling narrative around how this fits into what the company is doing.
Yes, the narrative
being able
is
to sort
critical.
of communicate that and be very sort of upfront and sort of transparent about the outcomes we're sort of seeking to drive. It seems like to some degree companies have gotten scared and sort of nervous around some of these things and pulled back a lot over the last sort of few years. But being able to really do this and do it with sort of integrity and sort of confidence and get the benefits of the types of outcomes that you're sort of seeking to drive, having that right sort of communication and sort of strategy with investors and others is super important.
It's super important. And I don't necessarily like to showcase specific actions, but I think it's worthwhile in this one. So indulge me if you can. Recently, Apple came out with a pretty poignant communications initiative where they put out what they're doing from a decarbonization hierarchy perspective around every sort of product in their arsenal, let's call it, right, on their shelves, and looking at it holistically. They had Octavia Spencer in that ad, and I think that resonated really well and broadly. I think they did a really good job of communicating that. Do you think that that's an example of corporate sort of leadership that will be followed? Because from my experience, corporates tend to move in packs. The first folks go, and then that gives confidence to the second wave, and then effectively we saw that go in 2020, 21 as net zero commitments became de rigueur. They started to go, and then a few started to pull back, and then we've been in this funk for the last few months. You seeing that kind of example of Apple and a few others as an inflection point, maybe in the positive direction?
Absolutely, and there's a lot of talk, obviously, about what's happened with kind of the Apple announcement of the things. To me, what's super sort of exciting is it does sort of completely go against the tide of kind of the other trend that we had seen with so many sort of companies over the last 12 months. In some ways, I was deeply sort of surprised myself that Apple sort of stepped out so boldly at a time when all of the sort of carbon neutral claims and other things is moving in a different sort of direction.
But that's kind of their core ethos, right? Now looking back to the old Steve Jobs days, right? Think different. So I hope that actually sets the new paradigm and
in some ways, I think it's also it provides a good archetype for other companies, right? Being very sort of clear around how renewables and sort of RECs sort of fits into the mix. How they've sort of thought about sourcing, how they think about nature, and kind of building a more integrated sort of story there together,
multi-layered,
which doesn't leave any sort of ambiguity about why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, I think that's the key. And so it's how do we distill this very complex subject matter into a very simple way of effectively communicating it and distilling that for
which of
public
course
consumption, which is a tricky bit.
Which is not the industry's sort of default mode.
No,
by any means.
We're too verbose, myself included, and many practitioners in this space, we're very esoteric, and we need to break that mold, effectively look at being inclusive, have open dialogue, make it acceptable as a common approach, and effectively drive the transition. You talked about channeling finance in the billions, hundreds of billions of dollars towards decarbonization. That's the only way we can do it. We cannot do it in a small sort of mindset. We have to be inclusive. It has to be much broader.
Yeah, no, really, absolutely agree. The only way we're going to be able to meet net zero and our climate goals is to really to sort of unlock that flow of carbon finance.
Yeah.
If we don't sort of do it soon, the forests and the nature and other things are going to be lost, and we're going to have a much harder time to rebuild all these sort of things from a climate perspective moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I just want to kind of bring it home. I'd love to get your final and parting thoughts here. Essentially, you're talking about ultimately the implementation piece. So where do you think things go from here in the next 12, 24 months to drive that action and to achieve that scale?
Well, I think that is really the question, right? In my mind, 2024 is a pivotal year as we think about the carbon market and the ability to sort of scale up climate action. If we are able to retake control of the narrative, change perceptions about the market, that is very likely to flip around many of the things that have kind of gone against us over the last 12 months. I think some of that sort of corporate demand that is pent up and on the sidelines is going to go forward. Clearly, it will sort of take time for boards and others to get comfortable again, but I think progressively that will sort of build. We can continue to sort of capitalize on the great sort of investment that we've seen on the supply side, where there's a lot of sort of interest to do more and sort of take that sort of forward. And equally important, we should be able to capitalize on the huge amount of work that's been done over the last 2 years with ICVCM, VCMI, and sort of other sort of efforts to strengthen the integrity of the market and other things, and hopefully also tie that together with some positive outcomes, maybe at sort of COP28, as we look at sort of compliance in Article 6 and other things. Ultimately, that to me is kind of the call to action as we sort of look at the sort of pathway forward. If we kind of rise to the occasion, we could be in a very different place this time next year.
Let's hope so. I think that's a really great way to end. Thank you for that. I agree. It's a call to action. So let's get on with it and drink to that. Cheers.
Thanks.